Now look, hear me out. I like art. I can look at Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa and wonder about that smile. I can look at Edvard Munch's The Scream and see the horror in his eyes. But I'll tell you right now, at around 1 AM, when a number of you sent me this picture to my email, I'll tell you right now, it stopped me sleeping, so much so that I'm here making this video at this ungodly hour here in the UK to discuss what might be arguably the largest refresh of Synology products in 2025 at least I've ever seen. When it's come to previous years when Synology revisit a number of their solutions and retool them, change a few CPUs, change the connections, they tend to do about 3 to 5 solutions a year. But what we're seeing now is a wholesale replacement of a number of the Plus series devices, majority of which are in desktop and a couple in Rackmount. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to go through all of the solutions that we now know in the first half of 2025 that are going to be refreshed and what we like and maybe stuff that we're not going to be overly keen on. But before we go any further, huge credit to 9 East over on ChipHell and Error204 over on imnks. These two users here on 2 separate forum platforms showed images from a Synology event, which, among many things, revealed a plethora of new Synology refresh solutions for 2025. Their forum posts and the threads that followed are linked below, so I recommend you check those out. But let's crack on with the new solutions for 2025. So first up, I want to talk about probably the most popular desktop options that people are waiting for, and that is the new DS525 Plus, the DS1525 Plus, and the DS725 Plus, replacing the existing 4, 5, and 2 bay later in 2025. Now, there's 3 main changes to talk about, depending on which system. And we're going to move the DS725 to its own little side because we're going to have to come back to that later. The DS925 Plus and the DS1525 Plus are seeing their AMD Ryzen CPUs change. The original dual-core 4-thread R1600 processor is being replaced with the quad-core and 8-thread V1500B AMD embedded Ryzen processor. That's right, they're using the same CPU that was formerly in the 6 and 8 and 12 bay, released in 2020 to 2022. This isn't the first time we've seen Synology repurpose CPUs from a higher generation and move them lower into the portfolio. They've done it before with other processors, and at the very least we're seeing a processor here that is increasing the cores and increasing the threads. The 4 and the 5 bay there and the 2 bay that we'll come back to later on, all of which were kind of reprofiled in 2022 and 2023, originally away from multimedia and home prosumer use and more towards business use, high file processing performance there, and for users that want to run Docker, virtual machines, that kind of stuff. Now, that CPU change isn't the only change on the table there. Alongside that, the 1 gigabit Ethernet ports are being upgraded to 2.5 gigabit Ethernet, and I think we can all say it together, about bloody time. Synology were pretty much behind everyone else when it came to upgrading the default 1 gigabit network ports to something bigger. In fact, pretty much everyone else made this step back in 2020, 2021. Still, nonetheless, it's nice to see it here. However, the third change, which I'm going to have to add a big asterisk of TBC, is that it looks like the 5 bay, the 4 bay, and the 2 bay are not going to support the 10 gig adapter that was available on the 4, 5 and 2 bay. Now, I say that because the documentation from the forms that the photos of slides from the forum post that we mentioned earlier on, again linked in the description below, when they do make reference to the E10G22T1 Mini, I'm catching available at parties, that adapter there is listed with a line scratched through it. So it looks like they're not going to support a 10 gig upgrade. So Synology giveth and Synology taketh in terms of network internet connectivity. And keep in mind, of course, with that CPU, that you're getting more cores and threads, but it is a drop in clock speed from the R1600 down to the V1500B. There is also a drop in TDP, of course, but still nonetheless, that might be something you want to know. But either way, still no integrated graphics on this tier of the product family. Now, earlier on I mentioned that I was popping the DS725 Plus to the side. Now, the reason I was doing that is because unlike the 5 and the 4 bay, it looks like that system is maintaining the R1600 processor there. That R1000 embedded Ryzen, a dual-core 4-thread processor, but the system is seeing an upgrade to 4 gig of DDR4, I believe, ECC memory, as opposed to the 2 gig in its predecessor. And again, it looks like it's not going to support that adapter there. I am curious, by the way, about the 4, 5 and the 2 bay and their M.2 NVMe slots, something we'll talk about later on. But overall, it probably is not going to be a very exciting upgrade across these three for most users, but as long as Synology are able to maintain the price point that we've already seen, as they have done in previous generations of the 2, 4 and 5 bay, maintaining the price, even with inflation and currency conversions and production costs, if they can maintain that price point, at the very least, we're seeing a refresh here that does give you more than its predecessor. But I still have questions about that. Next up, we move on to the Intel-powered refreshes that are coming. Now, about a year and a half ago, Synology rolled out 2 new Intel-powered solutions in the DS224 Plus and the DS425 Plus, a 2 and a 4 bay Intel Celeron-powered solution, the J4125 processor. Now, both of these products are being refreshed in 2025, which, particularly for the DS224 Plus, is remarkably soon. Now, what are these refreshes entailing? Well, it looks like just a network interface. The 1 GBE ports are being refreshed to 2.5 GBE. Now, we're still waiting for confirmation on things like the M.2 NVMEs on the 4 bay device, but the CPU is remaining the same, the Intel Celeron J4125, that quad-core 2.0 GHz CPU that can be burst up to 2.7, with integrated graphics, I believe, up to about 800 MHz when pushed. So, it's good that Synology are still supporting an integrated graphics CPU, and again, if they maintain the price point the same as the existing 2 and 4 bay in the market right now, then there's not a huge amount to complain about, at least in terms of what you're getting for your money compared to their other offerings, but still nonetheless, this is a CPU, I believe, from 2019, and not only is it no longer in production with Intel, Intel have abandoned the Intel Celeron naming convention, favouring the Alder Lake and the Twin Lake, the N-series processors. So, I kind of hope that Synology might at least err towards the N100, but it looks like on this 2 and 4 bay, they are sticking with that J4125 processor moving forward and are really just upgrading the network interfaces. There may be other changes, but there wasn't anything made clear in those slides. But alongside those 2 Intel processor NASs, there's also a third one. We're seeing, after a very long hiatus, a refresh of the 6 bay 2.5-inch SATA Media NAS. The original, released in 2020, the DS620 Slim, which was an Intel quad-core powered CPU NAS, is rolling out in a newer iteration in the DS625 Slim. Again, the same CPU in the Intel J4125 quad-core processor, but it's upgrading to 2.5 gigabit Ethernet NICs. That was one of the biggest complaints its predecessor had, that the original 620 had 6 SATA bays and only 1 GBE, 2 1 GBE ports. Now, this system having 2.5 GBE, hopefully 2 ports, will mean that you can at least get a little bit more of the oomph that those SSDs are capable of outputting there. But still, nonetheless, this isn't a huge step forward over its predecessor. And again, if they maintain the price point, there isn't a huge amount to complain about, but I'm not going to call any of these 3 solutions particularly exciting. Next up, 8 bay NAS. Now, the DS1825 Plus that we've been talking about for what feels like a billion years is genuinely a thing. We knew it was. We saw enough leaked reference points on Google from Synology websites that we talked about last year, and it is definitely a thing. And much like our video on the DS1825 Plus and all the information we knew and could extrapolate from the information we found, it looks like it is going to have the same CPU as its predecessor. It's still rolling out with the V1500B. I hate seagulls. It's early in the morning here. Now, that's the same CPU, but as you won't be surprised to hear, they are upgrading the NICs to 2.5 gig. However, it looks like, and hopefully I'm wrong here, that whereas the 1821 that came before it, or is at least still available until this refresh, had 4 1 gig Ethernet ports, this has 2 2.5 gigabit Ethernet ports. So on the one hand, they have upgraded the NICs, but I need confirmation whether there's going to be 2 or 4, because otherwise the gain you're making is only around a gigabit once you factor in things like SMB multi-channel or link aggregation, load balancing, etc, etc. Now, it's not the only 8 bay they are refreshing. They're also refreshing the XS series device, the DS1825xs Plus, that 10 GBE 8 bay system that again was released around 2 years ago, maybe 2 and a bit, is seeing a refresh. Normally XS series devices don't see a refresh for 4 to 5 years. This is quite soon for this. Now, unsurprisingly, not much has changed. Same CPU, it still has the 10 gig Ethernet, but it looks like the two 1 gig ports that that system rolled out with, and of course there was the out of bounds port, are being upgraded to 2.5 gigabit Ethernet. It looks like the majority of these refreshes happening are occurring in basically upgrading the status quo from 1 GBE to 2.5 GBE across the board. But this does, across all of the solutions I've discussed, does bring up a question for me, and that is, calling these wholesale refreshes, I'm kind of surprised. Previously, when Synology have made smaller iteration changes to some of their products in exchange of a CPU, in exchange of a PSU, they've introduced the 2 on the end there. You see solutions like the DS916 Plus 2, the DS216 Plus 2. It's normally when there's a small variation, like a sub-revision here. And although some of these solutions, like the 4 and the 5, have actually got quite a lot of changes, some of the solutions in this list, I would argue, are small revision changes, and therefore calling them a wholesale refresh, and they're not saying that, by the way, I am, but thinking of them as refreshes might not be great. Now, the only Rackmount NAS that was mentioned was the DS1825 RP+, arriving with that V1780 CPU, again a quad-core 8-thread AMD embedded Ryzen with 10 GBE on board. Almost certainly the 1 gig ports are going to be swapped out for 2.5G, again TBC, we don't know. But that's really it. There was no other mention of perhaps a 1U Xeon powered one, a follow-up to the 1619 or anything like that. There was 2 expansion devices that were discussed, the RX1225 RP+ and the DX525. These are now moving away from eSATA connections towards USB Type-C, which on the face of it sounds really good, and indeed all of the expandable options I talked about today, like the 5-bay and the 4-bay I mentioned earlier that support a Synology expansion, will need to use the new expansion devices, which use USB Type-C. But on some of the documentation shared from the slides that I mentioned earlier, they refer to that USB-C as a 6 gigabits per second connection, which is kind of weird because USB Type-C for me is either USB 3.2 Gen 1 at 5 gigabit or USB 3.2 Gen 2 at 10 gigabit. 6 gigabit feels kind of whack, and I don't quite understand whether this is them using USB-C on the existing SATA lane or some kind of converter. Finally, alongside a lot of memory upgrades that were shown in the slides, one of the final slides did show some hard drives and SSDs. Now, the majority of them, I'm not going to say we're going to brush past, but some of them we already knew about as the latest iteration of their hard drives. Again, staying with Toshiba, I believe Seagate drives as well in the Plus series drives. But the one that was interesting was an SNV drive there. Now, one of the SNVs, or the M.2 NVMe drives they had there, seems like it is an enterprise class SSD. Now, a lot of Synology solutions now arrive with those M.2 NVMe slots, and a lot of the 22, 23 and now 24 series devices actually support SSD storage pools, but only if you use Synology's own SSDs to do so. And one of the hurdles was that Synology's M.2 NVMe's, the SNV3400 series and the 3410, were pretty low performance drives that were designed more for caching than they were for raw storage. So you could use third-party SSDs for caching, but not for pools. Now, it looks like that high-performance M.2 NVMe is almost certainly going to be so users can make the most of those M.2 NVMe slots. Keep in mind that in most cases, those slots are reduced to Gen 3 times 1 speed, so we're only going to get a gigabit to start with. Now, I'm going to hold off real verdicts and reactions to these until we get more information. I do want to hear what you guys think. I'm going to open up a thread on Reddit shortly and hopefully get a lot of your feedback that we can include in a follow-up video on this very subject. But right now, for me, there are still questions that need to be answered, such as, number 1, is this adapter not going to be supported in the newer generation devices? Because I've grown to love this little guy. Secondly, what's going to be the position on hard drives? Is it going to be a case that these devices are going to arrive with the same profiling of hard drive support that the existing 22 and 23 and 24 series have, which is that those solutions are predominantly associated with Synology hard drives for compatibility with a small range of third-party drives from Seagate, WD and Toshiba? Or is Synology going to take an even further step towards only supporting their own drives in their systems for uniformity? And is there even the possibility of these systems arriving pre-populated? We don't know yet. Also, where the hell is the 6-bay? show the 6 Bay some love. Synology still have the DS1621 Plus listed on their website, but there was no mention in these refreshes of a new 6 Bay device. I understand the 1621xs Plus was sort of phased out after the 8 Bay XS, but there is just a gaping kind of dated hole in their portfolio for a 6 Bay. So maybe we'll see something like that in the second half of the year. But this has been all of the new solutions revealed in a Synology event over on the other side of the world. And right now at 5 AM, I'm going to have a coffee and try to digest this a little bit more. Thanks again to 9 East and Error204 for sharing online. And again, links towards those forum posts are below. But seriously, let me know what you guys think of this in the comments. Keep in mind that if these solutions arrive at the same price the current ones do, then these refreshes have to be looked at in that light. Again, I'll be opening up a thread on Reddit to talk about user reaction to this, and we'll make a follow-up video kind of going through what people think of these new refreshes for 2025. Thanks again to 9 East and Error204 for sharing photos of the event that they attended online, and again there'll be links below over to their forum post. And thanks to everyone that emailed me at 1 in the morning and woke me up and brought me here to my office. I'm going to go have a coffee and splash some water on my face. I invite you to do the same. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.